Nick Diaz's run in Strikeforce was truly one of a kind and a joy to watch at the time. Now, this was back in 2009, and he was coming off a run from Elite XC, which was a rival company to the UFC. Strikeforce ended up buying Elite XC, so Nick Diaz went there. And the UFC at the time in 2009 had stars such as George St. Pierre, Anderson Silva, and BJ Penn. But I believe that the fans were really clamoring and wanting for a true kind of fighter with that fighter gangster spirit that they could relate to. Diaz was known as the Stockton bad boy. Hailing from Lodi, California, he had that type of gangster feel and personality to him. He didn't want to be bothered before the fights. The interviewers would try interviewing him. He would answer in short bursts and go on tangents, and he just wanted to get into the cage, do his thing, and get out. But when he was in the cage, he really brought the action. He would pepper you to the body and head with continuous shots, all while taunting you with his hands up in the air, and even the odd time he would land his patented Stockton slap. And Nick Diaz was a cardio machine, famously known for competing in triathlons in the off-season. This would then tremendously help in his MMA fights when it came to his cardio, because his gas tank would be off the charts. He would use his gas tank to pour into his opponents, eventually tiring them and then finishing the job. In 2009, I was about 4 years into watching MMA, getting into it after that infamous bout between Forrest Griffin and Stephan Bonner, when they had that Ultimate Fighter finale bout in 2005 in the UFC. That's when I got into it. So when I caught wind that Nick Diaz was going to fight Frank Shamrock in Strikeforce in the main event, I was like, oh man, I'm freaking hyped. I totally want to check that out. So the year was 2009. The Sherdog forums were more popular than ever. YouTube was bought by Google a year previously, so they were also at a peak. And there was just countless amount of ways to keep in touch with the fights, pictures, MMA media, and so on. But I remember the hype for this fight being particularly huge. Like, everyone wanted to see it. Everybody was talking about it online. And I remember Frank Shamrock being like really coy and snarky during the press conference specifically. And, you know, unlike his brother Ken, who's like more serious and just in your face, like Frank was coy and like snarky about things. And he was like talking down to Diaz, sort of like as a little kid.
About Nick, he's got no power in his punches. He stands straight up. He leaves his chin available. He has little head movement. His takedown sucks. And that's all the bad stuff I'm going to say about him.
But Nick Diaz wouldn't take shit. Like, he would quirk right back at Frank and say something back, and the crowd would be laughing and shit like that.
I also have a parking spot in the back with my name on it. Do you have that, Nick? Apparently Nick didn't get one.
Oh, I don't have a fucking dressy suit either.
And I just remember the banter between the two being really entertaining, and it just got more people hyped to see the fight, basically. But to be honest with you, I was cheering for Frank Shamrock going into this fight. Now, I think a huge reason why was because his fighting style, like, he was the first complete package and prototype in MMA. Like, he had the striking, the grappling, the submissions, everything together. And that was from the 90s. He was like the first guy to put all those things together and do them quite well. Even better than his brother Ken, I would say. Like in that 1999 fight with Tito Ortiz for the middleweight championship in the UFC. Like, he outstriked Tito, and he made him tap out due to strikes, which was huge because Tito Ortiz was basically a huge unstoppable force in 1999. And I just remember Frank looking physically, you know, great, you know, aesthetically and everything like that going into the Diaz fight, even though he was somewhat inactive, only fighting a few times in the 2000s, while Diaz was more busy fighting 3 times in 2008. So that was the lore there. And basically, Nick Diaz still felt unproven to me. I felt like he didn't show everything to that point, and he kind of rubbed me the wrong way as well, to be honest with you. And then we had the actual fight. The date was April 11th, 2009 in San Jose, California, the Shark Tank basically. And Big John McCarthy, the legend himself, was reffing the fight. And like I mentioned before, this had a very big fight feel to it within the MMA community, online, etc. Main rivals to the UFC, putting on this huge fight between a UFC legend, Frank Shamrock, and this up-and-comer, Nick Diaz. So, yeah, being super interested in it. It was really cool. And as soon as the stare down happens, like Nick Diaz is totally just mean mugging Frank Shamrock. And of course, Frank Shamrock has that coy kind of smirk look on his face, like he's not worrying about anything. So that was cool. And of course, they did not touch gloves. And as soon as the fight starts, Diaz has his hands up. And this is what I love about Nick Diaz. He has his hands up and he starts talking shit to Frank Shamrock. It was great. Shamrock still had this coy, kind of smile on his face. But then Nick Diaz started to land some combos. Frank gets taken down by Nick Diaz, gets controlled in side mount. But Frank has always been good with submissions, like I mentioned before. So he's able to reverse a key lock from Nick Diaz, and he gets back to his feet. So Shamrock lands a good punch, but Diaz just takes it, and he continues to talk smack to him. And I just love how Big John is letting this all happen. He's reffing the fight, he's being serious, but this is part of the fight game. People talking back and forth, talking smack. It's like a war of attrition, but also a mental game as well. So I just really like how Big John let that happen. And as we get later into the round number 1, Diaz throws more and more punches, and then he throws his hands up and he tells Shamrock, "Come on." It's just another Nick Diaz trait, which is really cool. Classic Diaz. He's luring his opponents in while using their energy and using his energy, but he's got the energy advantage at all times, pretty much. Diaz ends up getting full mount at the end of the round, and he's raining down punches, but Shamrock, still being coy and cocky, is smiling the whole time. And this fight is just crazy, and I loved how crazy it was. Super entertaining. And then we have round 2 starting off hot, as Diaz then does another classic trademark, bringing his head forward, saying, "Come on, bitch."
5-minute rounds. Frank Shamrock in the short black trunks. Nick Diaz in the long black trunks. Diaz is a character. Love him or hate him.
He's upping the tempo. He's really getting into the energy, and this is what Nick Diaz would do. He would start getting more, taunty, throwing his hands up, peacocking his head forward, telling the person to come on, and this would be Nick Diaz kind of gauging up his power meter, so to speak, in like a video game. He'd be more into it. Frank was doing his best, trying to land punches, trying to evade, but Nick was just like throwing his hands freely, the classic way. And while Nick Diaz is throwing his hands freely, it still seems like his gas tank is at 100%, which is crazy. And as this is going on, Frank is looking more bloodied. He's looking like he's fading. Diaz keeps on peppering punches, like he's chipping away at Frank's health bar. And then we have Nick Diaz hunting for the body, which is a classic. I love how Nick Diaz would do this. He would kind of wind up his punches and just hunt for the body and really whip them in there. So he was winding up, he was doing that, and Shamrock was basically on his bicycle, on his heels, just kind of backing away, trying to figure out this young up-and-comer, like, what the hell am I dealing with here? How am I going to beat him? And, props to Frank. He would try to press forward at times and land his best and use the skills and, strategies he would have. But Nick would just do such a good job at keeping Frank at arm's length and, you know, keeping him at bay basically. And he would keep him at arm's length. Even Nick would do like a little shoulder roll at times, akin to Floyd Mayweather. And it was just such a joy to watch. Midway into round number 2, Nick would start landing hard on Frank Shamrock, backing him against the cage. And it was at this point where Frank's face was just like completely battered. Nick had his hands totally down, sticking his chin out, you know, trying to get Frank to come at him more. But at this point, Frank seemed done. You know, he tried to come forward a little bit with some strikes, but Nick would just counter instantly, winging his punches from all angles. You know, Shamrock was in huge trouble at this point, as Nick would then wind up this huge right hook and land it straight to Frank Shamrock's body, causing him to crumple down to right to his ass. You know, he'd crumple down just like a tower collapsing. And as Frank crumpled down, Nick would just lean in and come down and land in like these huge barrages of punches. And that was it. Big John waved off the fight, and Nick Diaz won. He took it in round number 2. It was such a good fight, so entertaining to see. But what was even better is that right after Nick finished Frank, he raises up his hand and he brings him to his feet, and he points to him like, "This is the man, this is the legend." And that was the cool thing about Nick. He would have like beef with you leading up to the fight and everything like that. But once you guys get through the fight, there's a huge respect there, a camaraderie that you guys got through it, and it's over, and they're basically cool at this point, right? So yeah, that fight against Frank Shamrock in 2009 in Strikeforce is what really got me into Nick Diaz from that point on. So a couple months later, Nick Diaz takes on Scott Hands of Stone Smith. And early in this fight, Nick Diaz just lands some thudding shots to Scott Smith's body, and they just sound nasty.
Nick Diaz, right hook!
But the thing about Scott Smith, he's a pretty hard hitter, and he does hit Diaz with some shots, but it seems like Diaz just absorbs them. And I remember this being a thing about Nick Diaz was his durability, his ability to take shots and just move forward with a straight face like nothing happened, and he'd be taunting you as it went on. And it was really cool. And Diaz just started to absolutely pour on the volume into Scott into round 2, Diaz being known for his volume, and he was just teeing off on Scott's head like a volleyball, just continuously, you know, hitting him with some great body shots as well, dropping him at the end of the round. And then into round 3, Scott Smith tries to bring it a bit more, but Nick Diaz just drops him with a body shot and quickly turns him around, sinks in the rear naked choke, and Scott Smith taps. And that's all she wrote for that fight. Another win for the Stockton bad boy, Mr. Nick Diaz. And then we fast forward to January of 2010, and Nick Diaz is facing striker Marius Zeromus. Now, I love this stare down between these two, super intense, and Marius comes right out the gate in this fight, throwing super fast strikes, but Nick does a good job of reacting well to it, adjusting, finding his boxing, tuning it in. It looks like he's starting to have fun. He clinches with Zeromus, getting him against the cage, throwing some strikes, finding his range, but then out of nowhere, Zeromus throws a huge shot, and Nick Diaz goes down. Marius follows up with some strikes, but then Nick does a good job of spinning out of it and recovering well. And then Nick gets back to his feet, and he lands a huge uppercut. And after that huge uppercut, he lands some good body shots as well. And at this point, Marius, he looks like he's out on his feet. Diaz then throws a crazy right hook, and Zeromus goes down. What a friggin' comeback. Diaz is on fire, the crowd is going nuts, and this is the fight that won Nick Diaz the Strikeforce welterweight title. So a few months later, in October 2010, we have Nick Diaz taking on KJ Noons. Now this was kind of a redemption fight for Diaz, because he fought KJ in Elite XC in 2007. but he lost that fight, but it was due to cuts after the first round. So yeah, KJ won that fight, but it wasn't 100% convincing. So basically, here in October of 2010, in Strikeforce, we have the ultimate rematch between Nick Diaz and KJ Noons for the welterweight championship. So this fight starts off, Nick Diaz and KJ, they're standing off, and it starts off with Nick Diaz landing one of his patented Stockton slaps. You gotta love it for the rivalry. And pretty much he lands the Stockton slap, and then after the Stockton slap, he drops KJ Noons early, even more convincing. He controls him on the ground, pretty much outboxes him on the feet for the rest of the round. And that's round one. But going into round two, Noons starts to land a lot. He starts to land a lot more. And as he lands a lot more, he cuts Nick Diaz up. And this is akin to their first bout in Elite XC. And then they start talking back and forth. Things are really starting to cook up. KJ keeps outlanding Nick in this round, landing some hard shots as well. And if you ask me, I believe KJ won round two. Then we go into the middle fight, round three. I feel like it's a mostly feeling out period between these two. I feel like Noons is doing a good job at mirroring Nick Diaz's tactics and his technique. He's being a hard target to hit, but also matching his cardio. So this is basically tit for tat here, but a very entertaining fight to watch as well. So in round four, it's more the same, back and forth, but Diaz lands a hard knee on KJ, and Noons is visibly hurt at this point. KJ stays on his feet somehow, and the two keep going at it into the fifth round, and it's another back and forth battle. It's hard to say who's winning the round, but both of them have incredible gas tanks and they're pouring it on, and they just keep going back and forth until the 5-minute rounds ends. And if you ask me, I feel like Nick Diaz won rounds 1, 3, and 4, while Noons probably won rounds 2 and 5. But regardless, it felt like a really close fight, back and forth, basically a striking battle, but it was very entertaining to watch. And ultimately, Nick Diaz won the unanimous decision on the judges' scorecards, and I thought that was a great test for Nick Diaz, and it was also his first title defense. And then to kick off the new year in 2011, we have Nick Diaz taking on the Brazilian Evangelista Cyborg, who was then married to Chris Cyborg, the women's champion in Strikeforce, the ultimate badass who was on a undefeated streak at the time. So we have them fighting, and as soon as the fight starts, there's another badass stare down, and Cyborg is just completely stone-faced, and Nick Diaz is completely in his face, just mean mugging him. The classic Nick Diaz mean mug. So we know this is going to be intense. And as soon as the fight starts, as soon as the bell rings, we have Nick Diaz talking up a storm. He's talking up a storm. He's hyped up. But then Cyborg starts to land some devastating leg kicks, and they're landing well. And this is the thing about Nick Diaz and the Diaz brothers in general, is the leg kicks. We would find out more into their career later that the leg kicks would be an Achilles heel basically to the Diaz brothers. So we have Cyborg landing the leg kicks, but he's also swinging very wildly with his hands. And as he's swinging wildly, he's landing some shots, but as usual, Diaz is doing a good job at absorbing these shots. He's swinging too, but he's dialing in his boxing, trying to get his, padded in swings to the body, some shots to the head. We see Cyborg already getting tired at this point, sucking wind, while Nick Diaz, the triathlete, still looks like he's 100% in his gas tank. So as their first round comes to the end, we have a camera shot of Chris Cyborg watching from ringside, and she has a worrying look on her face, so it's not looking good. So the second round starts. Cyborg is still landing leg kicks, but Nick Diaz doesn't care at all. He moves forward, he's saying come on, he's so into the fight, and this is the same tried and true strat that Nick Diaz has used through his Strikeforce career, to the point where he's that cardio conditioned athlete who gets you tired, and then when you're tired, he's just going to be that wet blanket and he's going to pour it more and more onto you to the point where you quit. So at this point, Nick Diaz is pouring it on. He's relentless, teeing off at Cyborg's head. Then we have 30 seconds left in the round. Cyborg ends up hitting a trip takedown. Nick Diaz is on his back, but then Nick Diaz quickly moves his hips, throws his legs up, locks in an arm bar, extends it, and Cyborg is forced to tap. And Nick Diaz wins by the classic armbar submission, which was awesome to see. You know, Nick is a great grappler, and whenever he pulls off submissions, it's really cool and fun to see, basically. So Nick Diaz wins that fight, but then there was a moment after this fight where Nick Diaz is kind of against the cage and he's talking to someone. He's like kind of shaking his head and he's like saying, F you, bitch. And he's really talking shit. And the camera cuts to Cyborg's wife, Chris Cyborg, after. And of course, as a fan, you're going to think Nick Diaz is talking shit to her, you know, as she's sad and as she's crying. So it just seemed like really bad douchebag behavior, and it kind of made me second think about Nick Diaz. I'm like, what the hell? Like, that was a great fight, but why would he be like talking shit to this guy's wife who's crying after she just saw her husband get defeated, basically? But then I remember reading online after somewhere that Nick Diaz wasn't talking shit to Chris Cyborg, but he was talking shit to like some fans or maybe his cornermen. I'm not sure, but basically the lore was that he wasn't talking shit to Chris Cyborg, which was, a relief, because she just seemed innocent watching ringside and her husband just got defeated. So of course she would have been sad, right? And now we have Nick Diaz's final fight in Strikeforce. And I have to say, it's got to be my favorite Nick Diaz fight of all time. And it's against Paul Semtex Daly. This was in April of 2011. And it's just such a crazy fight, start to finish. There's so much action. It feels like it's going so quick. It's amazing. And I'm going to break it down for you. So we have the start of the fight. You know, Big John is there. Gotta love Big John. And I think it's Big John's first time reffing Nick Diaz since the Shamrock fight. So we got Big John in the center. We got Nick and Paul Daly coming face to face for the stare down. Of course, Nick Diaz is doing the crazy mean mug, just looking this guy down. Paul Daly has a huge smirk on his face, like he's just ready to do this thing. He's not intimidated at all. And what I love here is that you hear an audible bitch from Nick Diaz as they're about to separate.
You want to touch gloves, touch them now. Step back so we can start.
And it's just so funny and very entertaining and very Nick Diaz-esque. You know what I mean? So as soon as the bell rings, Nick Diaz has his arms to his side, his head pushed forward. He's saying, come on, let's go. But let me tell you, Daly is also ready to fight, because shortly after this, Daly lands a huge lethal left hook that lives up to his Semtex name, because it sends Nick Diaz crashing down to the mat. Now, Paul Daly's kind of standing there. He's trying to follow up with strikes, but Nick's doing a good job, like in the Marius fight, of using his head movements, spitting out of it, and then eventually getting back to his feet. And then Nick Diaz starts to find some range. He starts ripping Daly to the body. Paul then shoots for a takedown as he looks like he's hurt by those body shots. Back and forth shots as they both stand up. Diaz is landing some standing elbows even. So much action is happening at this point. it's hard to freaking keep up. It's crazy. Daly then lands a good knee on Diaz, and then Nick closes in, but then Daly again hits a huge Semtex left hook to Diaz, and Diaz goes down even harder to the mat. Paul then does a better job of following up this time, raining down punches, and honestly, at this point, it looks like it's going to be over. But then, miraculously, somehow Diaz recovers by holding on to Paul. So, at this point, they both stand up. We have about 30 seconds left in the round here, round number 1, mind you. And then, all of a sudden, Nick Diaz starts to just rip to the body and head of Paul Daly again, with great combos right against the cage. And then Nick Diaz backs off a bit, and out of nowhere, unexpectedly, Daly just falls down. And Nick Diaz sees this, he jumps on top of Daly. We've got about 10 seconds left in the fight here, and Nick Diaz is just raining down punches on Paul Daly over and over and over. There's only a few seconds left in the fight. Big John comes in, he waves off the fight. It is all over. Nick Diaz wins this crazy war against Paul Daly, and it is such a freaking war and crazy fight. Oh my god. Nick Diaz is raising his hands as he's walking around the cage. Blood is dripping from his elbow, his eyebrow rather, and he just looks like a crazy warrior pacing around. What a freaking fight. Holy shit. That's got to be my favorite Nick Diaz fight of all time. And man, I gotta say, Nick Diaz had to be in his prime during this Strikeforce run. He was just such a joy to watch and such a character to get behind. He was kind of the anti-hero and opposite character of Georges St. Pierre, who was the welterweight champion of the UFC, while Nick Diaz was the welterweight champion of Strikeforce. And I remember a lot of fans, including myself, online, just kind of clamoring to get this fight between GSP and Nick Diaz to happen. And it would eventually happen a few years later in the UFC. But yeah, I gotta say, if you're a fight fan and you haven't seen the Nick Diaz run in Strikeforce, you gotta check it out, because it is truly something magical to watch. And that is why Nick Diaz's Strikeforce run was truly amazing. And he is one of a kind. Stockton. 209, baby. Thanks for watching. Peace.